Welcome to Seeking Alpha's CEO interviews, informed conversations with the best and brightest CEOs in the publicly traded markets. Quality of leadership is a decisive factor in stock performance. Our show provides intimate and in-depth investing discussions with industry leaders across all sectors of the marketplace. We publish excerpts on social media platforms and the full conversations on seekingalpha.com or on our highly rated Seeking Alpha mobile app under CEO interviews.
Welcome to Seeking Alpha. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond. Today, I'm joined by Robert Foster, CEO of Hepion Pharmaceuticals. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse.
So let's start off with an overview. How would you describe the Hepion business to somebody that's not familiar with the company?
Well, quite simply, what I'd say is that Hepion is a company, a biotech company that's working on the development of drugs. I would say the discovery and development of drugs for the treatment of serious liver disease. And in the serious liver disease category, I put two buckets there. One bucket would be NASH, which stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And the second bucket would be HCC, which stands for hepatocellular carcinoma, which is a liver cancer.
Okay. And can you tell us about NASH and how prevalent it is and how it might be able to be treated?
Sure thing. So NASH is really a severe form of NAFLD, all these acronyms, right? So NAFLD is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And if you think about where all this kind of plays together, about 1 in 4 people globally have a fatty liver. And, for the most part, people don't know. So, you and I, as we're sitting right here, could actually have a fatty liver without really even knowing about it. So for the most part, you're asymptomatic. But if things progress and you develop a more severe type of disease, which is inflammation, sort of like a swelling or inflammation of the liver, as well as fibrotic scarring of the liver, which is a protein called collagen that deposits in your liver to make it less functional, that would be called NASH. And if you relate NASH to NAFLD or the fatty liver disease, as I mentioned, 1 in 4 people globally have fatty liver disease. And about 20% of those people will have the more severe form, which is again called NASH. So overall, probably 5 or 6 or so percent of the population has NASH. So it's a fairly common disease.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast where one of the hosts used to joke around that he ate poorly and ate a lot of gas station food and joked about his horrible Wendy's diet. And he did this for a series of years. Not a horribly overweight guy, just kind of an average, a little bit out of shape, not super serious about his health. And he came on the show about 3 or 4 months ago and shared that he, in fact, did have fatty liver disease, and since has been kind of going on this journey of cleaning up his diet. And he's kind of raised a bit of awareness about this to me. He's somebody that's about 41 years old too. I'm in my mid 40s, so I could certainly identify with that. So I was surprised, to learn about his situation, and hearing you say up to 5%, that's a pretty shocking number.
Yeah, it's actually very shocking. And there's also something called lean NASH. So doesn't necessarily imply, like you mentioned, eating Wendy's and whatnot. So that would sort of kind of lead you to think that if you have, the supersized whatever and the fries and the shake and all that, that you're more apt to develop fatty liver and NASH, which is, probably true. But also you can be lean. You can be somewhat lean looking, but still have a fatty liver. So there's something also called lean NASH. I think we can probably remember back to the show that was called Super Size Me. Mm-hmm. And, I could imagine what that liver looked like, but of course, I don't think they went into that in the program, but nevertheless, it is a very, very common problem. And without good diagnostics, that's a bit of a challenge. So how do you create a drug to treat a disease wherein a lot of people actually could be asymptomatic? And again, it's a diagnostic piece that's a little bit challenging as well.
How do you know, or what are the things people should look out for?
Well, I think if you go to your physician's office and you get some blood work done, and for example, your liver enzymes could be elevated, more maybe specifically something called ALT or AST could be elevated. If they do some blood work and they find that maybe your lipids or cholesterol, triglycerides are elevated, maybe your blood pressure is elevated. So it's sort of a clinical picture that will lead people to a diagnosis. But ultimately, I think really the diagnostic people are relying on right now, at least from a regulatory standpoint, would be the liver biopsy. And I don't think many people want to necessarily get that done when they're going to visit their physician.
Right. And so talk to me about how Hepion is targeting NASH. What is the drug? How are you attacking the space?
Well, I did mention, the fat and whatnot. So a lot of people are focused on reducing liver fat. And the idea there is that if you have a fatty liver, it will or can progress, to become scarring and fibrotic. And so NASH is really, the challenge there is you can have a fair bit of fibrosis as well as the fat, as well as the inflammation. We're not really targeting the fat so much at Hepion. What we are trying to do is to target the fibrosis. And for that, we've developed a molecule, it used to be called CRB431. We just were issued a generic name, and that was fairly recent. It's called renkofelstat. And renkofelstat is a direct acting antifibrotic. So again, when you link the diagnosis to the disease and you say, well, for example, a lot of people are asymptomatic, then what would compel people to go, seeking treatment? And so if you do become symptomatic and you do seek treatment, by then the damage could be done and it's almost too late for I would call it almost like soft measures or softer measures. So really it's the fibrotic component that Hepion is really chasing after, which really puts us in a different category relative to most companies working in the NASH space. So I would say that most companies working in the NASH space are working with, anti-metabolic or metabolic agents that address the, things like liver fat and metabolic syndrome. And that's not what we're doing.
And how does, I'm going to butcher the name again, even though I keep hearing it, renkofelstat? Yeah.
Renkofelstat, yeah.
Yeah, renkofelstat. Can you talk a little bit about how it works and where we are in the clinical pipeline?
Sure. So renkofelstat came out of decades and decades of experience and research that I personally started in 1988, I believe it was, when I started working on this category of drugs called cyclophilin inhibitors. And that's what renkofelstat is. It's a cyclophilin inhibitor. So I know that at this point in this interview, probably people will say, well, what the heck is a cyclophilin inhibitor? Well, cyclophilins are enzymes. So they're proteins that have a certain function that they play. It's an enzymatic function. And what that function does is it helps to fold proteins. And so if you think of a protein as, let's say, a string of pearls or whatever, sometimes that has to be sort of rolled over and folded on, itself. And it confers three-dimensionality to these proteins. But it's the cyclophilin that does that. And so sometimes we know that there's misfolded proteins, or maybe there's other functions that cyclophilins can actually have beyond protein folding, for example, in transcription, things like that. So by inhibiting a family of these enzymes called cyclophilins, of which there are 17 different types in humans, by addressing these isoforms of cyclophilins, that's how we're working to treat these liver diseases like, again, NASH and HCC.
And where are we currently in the clinical pipeline?
Oh, yeah, the second part of the question, right? So the pipeline right now the part of the pipeline that we're addressing right now is a phase 2. So for NASH, we've completed a phase 2A program. It was a short study. It was about 28-day study, or it was a 28-day study. It was dosing once daily orally. So this is an oral medication with renkofelstat. Then we had a 2-week follow-up. We looked at the primary outcome, which was safety, tolerability, and pharmacokinetics, or PK. But we also did some biomarker analysis. So we did look at things like the liver enzymes I mentioned previously, the ALT, for example, as well as some collagen markers. We looked at a few other things too. And once we finished that program, we set things in motion to start a phase 2B program, which is a larger study that'll be kicking off this year as well, probably about middle of the year. And then in parallel with that, we'll also be initiating the HCC study. So this year, starting probably about the middle of the year, we'll have these 2 programs going. And when I say going, what I mean by that is dosing subjects that have those indications. And right now, if you can imagine, there's a whole lot of activity happening in behind the scenes, because we have to line up our clinical trial sites. We have to get all the investigators lined up. We have to make sure we've got enough drug supply on hand, all these types of things that we have to get, laying the ground for.
And if things go well, I'm not super versed, and our audience probably has, a bit of a mixed background in terms of understanding the clinical trials and how long these typically could take. Can you talk about what the next phases might be and how long it might take until it's actually available on the market if things were to go well?
Mm-hmm. Well, a phase 2B program, it's 1 year of dosing of the drug. And again, it's once-day oral dosing. It'll be, a month or so follow-up. But the big first step is to recruit the subjects. And recruitment alone can take a year. So you've got a year recruitment roughly, and then you've got a year of treatment with some follow-up. So, you're looking at, a good solid 2 years, 2.5 years to get that NASH program phase 2B done. And then of course you go to your phase 3 program, which is, an extension. It's sort of carry on with a large number of subjects. But the phase 2B program, for example, is 336 people. And I think about 125 centers in North America and Europe. So that's a fairly big program. And by the time we get to the marketplace, I guess it's a good question, but it's going to be a number of years in the future. But one nice thing is that we did get FDA sort of a thumbs up on fast track. So that should help us to become eligible for certain programs that the FDA has. So maybe we can do, rolling submission and sort of getting the drug out earlier. So, it's all about speed, but there's only so much you can do, especially when we're addressing things like fibrosis, because fibrosis is not like, for example, treating high blood pressure where you give a medication, you can drop the pressures. Fibrosis is, once it's there, it's sort of more of a chronic disease. So it's going to take time to be able to reverse what's happened to the liver and sort of fix it. That's a fairly lengthy process.
And how are people finding the side effects from rencofilstat?
That's a really interesting question. And that's a question that we've also asked ourselves. And the answer is somewhat surprising. Because what I'm saying is that the drug rencofilstat is incredibly safe and well tolerated. And our team, when I say our team, our core R&D team that's now in Hepion is the exact same team that developed the drug prior to this. In my first company, I started in 1993. That company is now called Aurinia Pharmaceuticals, and the drug that Aurinia is commercialized almost exactly a year ago is called voclosporin. And voclosporin was a drug I discovered in the mid-1990s. And again, our team in Hepion helped develop that drug through the clinical trial program into, the phase 2 program. And then Aurinia, the current Aurinia people working in the company right now, that's the group that took it across the finish line to the commercial space. But the surprising answer, as I was mentioning, is that we haven't seen any side effects that are typically seen with drugs that like voclosporin, which suppresses the immune system. Rencofilstat, in contrast, does not suppress the immune system. And so when we remove that ability to suppress the immune system, we actually removed a lot of side effects. So this drug looks very, very clean. The animal toxicology studies that we conducted, so for example, a 6-month rat study and a 9-month monkey study, both of those studies were really, really clean. So all we've seen really in the clinic so far is some cases of constipation, but nothing really else.
And talk to me more about the fast track designation that you received from the FDA. What does that mean to a layman, and why is it important to you?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it helps us to become eligible for a few things like, a rolling submission or getting the drug to the marketplace sooner rather than later. But also it gives you kind of an open pathway to be able to have frequent communication with the FDA. So that's something that I think is important too, that it does sort of strengthen and open up the communication lines and gives you that access to get your drug to the patient sooner. But still, it is a process. It's gonna take it'll take a number of years to get this drug approved. But fast track is always something that is good to get, and it can only be received if the FDA looks at the program, looks at the drug, and says, this is an unmet medical need. So if the FDA looks at it and says there's a serious unmet medical need and it's underserved or maybe not served, that's one reason why you'd get a fast track approval. And right now, if you look at the NASH space, there are no FDA approved drugs for the treatment of NASH. So, again, that's probably one of the reasons why Hepion and other companies working in NASH as well will get a fast track approval, because that's something that's really highly needed.
So if I were to be diagnosed with NASH, what is the current state of the art for treating it?
Right now, you could probably treat it to some extent with diet and exercise. But there are other things that people are looking into. For example, drugs again that reduce liver fat, maybe controlling, obviously, like blood pressure, controlling your lipids. Whether you might need a lipid lowering agent, and there are some products out there that people are looking at too that reduce obesity. So if you can lose weight, that could probably be beneficial as well. But really, nothing at the moment that would be, an FDA approved medication.
And it sounds like, in terms of just being proactive and preventative, that it's just best practices for general health. Watch your diet, watch your blood pressure, watch your weight, maybe moderate alcohol, just kind of try and do the right things. Am I heading on the right path there?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of lifestyle choices we can make that probably can help us. But it is a challenge, and I think that's probably, that might be part of the reason why, if you look at NASH companies and look at their stock performance, let's say over the last year or so in the year 2021, the NASH space, for companies working in NASH is fairly disappointing. And you look at, if you let's say you invested, your hard-earned cash and you put it into NASH companies in 2021, you could have had a lot of disappointment. I was looking just recently at the market cap weighted performance for the year 2021, and the group of companies these are NASH companies, and I think there was 38 or 39 companies I looked at, but that whole entire group was down about, I think it was about 42 or 43% for the year. So that's a fairly big, smackdown, to the NASH companies. And again, I think it's because if you look at some of the companies that are later stage and have been working in NASH, the results they're seeing clinically are not spectacular. And there's been some people that have just said, okay, well, we sort of give up. But again, I think, and again, I don't have any crystal ball here, but I do think it's got a lot to do with how we approach the treatment of NASH. And I think if you approach it solely on the basis of trying to reduce liver fat, maybe you'll get there eventually in terms of reducing fibrosis, but it's going to take a long time. Whereas I think our approach is different, because we are going right after that fibrosis. And I think that's really, really important, because you're going to the crux of the matter, I think, in some respects, is what we're chasing after here.
And you also received an IND for the same drug for liver cancer. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's the same exact drug. And as I mentioned, we target these enzymes called cyclophilins. And we know that we probably inhibit, I would say, 10 or so of the 17 different types of human cyclophilins that are known. Two of those could be important. Cyclophilin B is probably important, or is important, when it comes to the formation of collagen. So you've got basically a triple helix. These are strands of collagen or procollagen that have to be sort of wound together in a triple helix. That folding and that winding and forming of the triple helix is regulated by cyclophilin B, at least in part. So if you remove the role of cyclophilin B, you sort of interrupt or disrupt the formation of the collagens. That, I think that's one important piece to it, but also as it relates to, NASH, but as you, if you also look at the other piece of the role of cyclophilin here, one of the other ones is called cyclophilin D, and cyclophilin D has a role to play in cell injury and cell death. So if we can inhibit that particular cyclophilin D, we should be able to, hopefully we can reduce the extent of cell injury and cell death. But there's also other cyclophilins that have roles in transcription and RNA splicing. There's also cyclophilin A that has a role in inflammation, as well as expression of cyclophilin A pops up, in certain metastatic cancers. So by addressing each one of these with one molecule, we think we've got a fairly good shot at treating, for example, HCC in addition to NASH. And that was the thinking behind when we went into the non-clinical or preclinical studies. We actually did a number of experiments, certainly in animals, and as well as ex vivo or in vitro studies to show that. And so every one of our studies we worked on preclinically shows that we have a very consistent effect. So for example, we can reduce fibrosis by extent of about 50% in the animal studies. But by the same token, we can also reduce the tumors that we saw in an animal model by about 50%. We've also done some work over in the UK where we've done these precision cut liver slices. And again, we've tried to look at some work on fibrosis in the slices, but we've also done some work in animals where we transplanted in these fairly nasty tumor cells. And in each case, we've seen a reduction. So it's, everything's looking positive at this point. Now, what we have to do, of course, is get to the clinic and see if we can bear that out.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the next step here?
So the next step really is just keep, nose to the grindstone, get to the clinic, make sure we can get that phase 2B, as I mentioned, get the phase 2B program going in NASH, get the phase 2A. So we're going directly into phase 2A in HCC, get that program rolling as well. And, all of that also implies that in the background, we've got a lot of coordinating to do. So, you'll only see, people tend to see what the end product is. They'll see, the part up on the surface is a little bit like an iceberg, but underneath you've got a whole group of people working on, the chemistry and manufacturing and making sure that all that is humming along beautifully. And also at the same time, you're working on continually filing your patents and keeping those up to date, which, gives us a fairly good runway from an IP perspective. So there's a lot of activities going on, but in terms of animal work and things like that, we probably don't have to be as aggressive because we really, to some extent, kind of exhausted quite a few of the studies that we needed to do. So those are already complete. And same with toxicology, most of those are pretty much done. So now it's just nose to the grindstone and just plow through the clinical program.
And you mentioned some of your peers or competitors in the NASH space were suffering a bit, and maybe everyone's kind of down in sympathy with that last year. Can you talk a little bit about what your expectations are for 2022? Not necessarily specific to Hepion, but just maybe about the space, about the NASH space, and more broadly in biotech.
Yeah, well, the NASH space. It's interesting. To some extent, we're all competing, but in a way, we're not, because I think ultimately these drugs have to be used in combination. So if we have the antifibrotic that I think we do, we probably would have better luck, treating patients if we were to combine with a drug that lowers the lipids or the fat content in livers. So that might be an ideal combination, is to use those drugs together. So I'm hoping that, I believe Madrigal is probably the furthest ahead, and really hoping that they're hugely successful. I'm actually hoping that all NASH companies are hugely successful, because as the old saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats. So we need to be one of those boats that rises with the NASH success. So I'm really, fingers crossed and hoping that things work out well for the NASH space, because we need to bring interest back to the NASH space, because after all, it is endemic. We need to do something about this. So I think 2022 we'll see some successes in the NASH space, and I think we'll see interest come back. But for, biotechs in general, I do think there's a lot of good value now because the biotechs have been beaten up fairly substantively. I think the NASDAQ, certainly the Russell microcap and some of the other indices, they're down. So, whenever things come down, it's like, you're building value if you're an investor and, you want to step back in. This would be the time to probably step in, or if not now, fairly soon.
Yeah, I think we've seen pretty bearish sentiment and a pretty big dislocation in smaller stocks versus bigger stocks. There's been a lot of great smaller companies that have just been getting killed lately, while those big companies, continue to excel. So sometimes people will look at the indices, see that it was a great year, but meanwhile, 2/3 of the stocks are actually suffering underneath.
Yeah, I think, I think 22 could be a good year for biotechs, and as we all know, things rotate. So the sectors kind of, come in and out of favor. It's almost like, flavor of the month type of thing. But I think the biotechs will come back because there's other things that maybe, might take a little bit of a kicking. But I'm certainly not an economist. I'm just, I've been doing this a long time for, like say 30 years or so. And I've been through a number of these cycles. And I think probably, 2008 would have been one of the nastiest ones. But again, that's whenever, I guess, even, Warren Buffett, talks about, when people are getting really nervous and afraid to invest in the stock market, that's the time to get in. And the flip side is true as well. When people become so over exuberant, valuations go sky high, that's the time to get out. And so I think this is probably, one of the valleys, or getting close to a valley. So this could be a good time to get back in.
My final question for us today is, can you leave us with one thing you're really excited about for this year? One thing you're excited about for 2022?
Wow. I would say I would like somehow to do something in the business development sphere. And by no means, though, I have anything, in mind here. So I know people might speculate if they watch, this interview, but they might say, oh, the CEO speculating something fantastic is going to happen. Like they get acquired by Pfizer, But anyway, I would like to see, some nice surprise come along in terms of maybe a business development opportunity or whatnot. But the reason I'm saying that is that if we're saying that we have an antifibrotic that's unique, and what else is kind of unique on top of that is that we not only have a NASH drug, we have an HCC drug, and those two things go hand in hand, because HCC is just sort of like along the spectrum of liver disease. It's on the far side of it, but that makes us unique, and as a unique opportunity with a team that's done this before, as I mentioned with voclosporin, when I had my forgetfulness. But anyway, with the voclosporin, the team has done it before. And so we're hoping now we can do it again, and create some excitement that maybe might surprise a few people. I'm hoping, might even surprise myself.
Well, this has been fantastic. I wish you the best of luck moving forward, and thanks for joining us on Seeking Alpha.
Okay, thank you very much.